I left off the last video saying that the whole world went into lockdown because of COVID. I think I can say this on behalf of everybody, that it was a strange time. Nobody really knew what to expect, but I guess there was nothing else to do but just return to normal. I started selling off some of the parts that I had. You can see here I was selling them off as a set, which returned me more money than if I was selling it separately. And after a few months, the Mongolia trip was cancelled, so I had nothing else to do but also sell the Derby Terror. And this is what normal life became. Some days my meetings would look like this. I'd be in the shed, being on work calls. And I'll be honest, I felt quite demotivated. I had big plans to go on this huge trip, but that got cancelled. And I didn't really know what the purpose of me working on this project was anymore, so I needed some motivation or some sort of goal to reach. And I found a beach race that was happening in Margate, actually the first ever official beach race in UK. That got me a little bit excited and a reason to get the bike running again. One of the necessary things for me was to change the pegs and the shifters. I got these SW Motec pegs, which were way more grippy than the original rubber ones. Also got some Free Spirits gear and brake shifters, which fold. So last time I broke my gear shifter, and the thinking was that they just fold under the weight of the bike. Here's them installed. Again, they were super expensive, but totally worth it. If you've watched my previous videos, you would have seen that I smashed my headlight. I wanted to come up with a solution where the headlight could be removable. I looked at a bunch of different options. It had to be small. I may as well upgrade to LED. I found this headlight that they normally use on Jeeps from JW Speakers. I think it's model number 97. And it has a low and a high beam, which worked perfectly for me. No reason why I couldn't use that. But I needed to create a bracket for it. So I started mocking up these different paper templates. Eventually, I also learned a bit of basic 3D design and mocked up the bracket in 3D piece of software with the thought of taking it to a professional laser cutter to have it made properly. But the quotes that they gave me for a single piece were far too high, so I ended up making it myself. I cut the bracket out of 3mm aluminium sheet. I also bought this vise attachment that folds the metal, but you can see from this picture that I overdid it a little bit and actually broke my vise, which I was quite proud of. I think if you don't break a vise in your life, then you're not trying hard enough. But they sent me, when I bought this on eBay, they sent me an extra vise by mistake. So I actually had a backup vise, which was perfect. With a bit more patience and going a little bit slower, I managed to bend the thick aluminium and make the bracket. And this is what it looks like installed. The previous mudguard that I had was a little bit too short and flimsy. It didn't actually cover that much of the spray coming off the front tire, so I decided to redesign the mudguard for the second time. Using my now acquired skill of creating templates and cutting them out of sheet aluminium, I did the same thing for the mudguard. Made a template, traced it over some aluminium, cut it out, made the holes for the bracket, mounted it, and even though it worked, the aluminium was really too thin because it would wobble at speed, and it was a solution temporarily. I'll eventually remake this mudguard again. I took another stab at improving my exhaust. So I removed the exhaust tips that I had here previously. All the exhaust tape also came off, and I started mocking up a new heat shield out of cardboard. I bought some perforated steel that I also cut to shape and bent it in the vise with some wood and made this sort of box-like cover. To baffle the sound of the exhaust, I got these DB killers of eBay. They just slide into the original exhaust and the bolt that holds them in place. This is what it was looking like a shotgun exhaust. Then I took another stab at painting the petrol tank. The whole bike was quite ratty. I wanted to give it a little bit of a personality. So I found an animal that lives in the Americas called the desert rat, and I thought the name sort of fit the project quite well. And Triumph have this vintage illustration of a roaring tiger, essentially copied as a rat. So here's a drawing I did on the iPad. I transferred that drawing onto the petrol tank with some paint pens and then did the outline, and this is what it ended up looking like. I should have made it a little bit bigger, but it was okay for now. Also added some writing on the side covers, and the bike ran even worse now than what it did before. I tried to download some maps online and tune it using the ECU Tune Map software, but nothing was improving the performance. The bike just felt underpowered and choppy. Eventually I took it to a professional who, rather than creating a custom map, what they do is they add an additional box on there, which was a power commander that they can use their own software to install a set of rules onto that box that would talk to the ECU and control the fuel to air mixture ratio. This is the bike being tuned, and I'll be honest that even after spending lots of money and having this power commander on there, the bike didn't really even run that much better. From the mapping results, the bike was actually down 20 horsepower, but I didn't have much time to do anything about that because the beach race was coming up. This was the day that I arrived in Margate, where the event was happening. I remember it really well. It was a very windy and wet, horrible day, but after being postponed many times because of COVID, I couldn't really miss this because it seemed like the only event actually happening that year. Pictures of me that somebody with a nice camera took. This is Paul's bike, the guy that I rode with in Morocco. You can see here the weather was horrendous, and you start the race by holding your left hand to your helmet so that you're not pulling the clutch in, and once the flag goes down you can go into gear and then off you go. I mean, the bike was still not running that well, but it was fun. Here's Tom and Paul, both guys who I met in Morocco. So even though we had one or a couple of lockdowns, it was evident that the pandemic wasn't going away, and this would be something that we'd have to deal with for several years to come. And it seemed like a really unpredictable time. A few months before this, I actually met someone and our relationship started to get a bit more serious. And the problem was that we were living in completely different parts of London. So if there was going to be another lockdown, we potentially wouldn't be able to see each other for months. Both a little bit exhausted by the London life and the uncertainty of COVID, we decided to leave. Obviously we did it within the COVID regulations of what was allowed, but we ended up in Mexico. I'll be honest here, it probably wasn't the most ethical thing to do, but we weren't breaking any rules and we were following all the strict guidelines that were in place. And the reality was there were no tourists. So we were away from crowds of people, we were abiding to the curfews, but we could be together somewhere in a much more beautiful place. And I still continued working remotely. I also couldn't get away from my inherent need to ride on two wheels. So sometimes I'd rent a motorcycle and go around the empty Mexican countryside. But all good things had to come to an end. Eventually, after almost a year away, we came back to London. I got offered a job in the office and I returned to working a desk job, which was not ideal for my mental well-being because I wanted to escape the city in the first place. But money had to come first, annoyingly. And in my spare time, I returned back to working on the bike that I've abandoned for such a long period, I literally went back to the drawing board and started making sketches of what the next iteration of the bike could look like. I looked at a bunch of different inspiration points, and I kept on coming back to 1960s desert sleds. Here's some more progressions of my sketches and what I wanted the next exhaust to look like. I also started designing a belly pan, different handlebars, and this brought me to the exhaust attempt number 3. I didn't do this myself. I found a professional fabricator, Tom Hitchcock's of Hitchcock's Motorcycles, that took on the project. And to my view, it was actually quite a complex shape to achieve. Managed to carefully bend the pipes coming from the header underneath the engine head and tucked in close to the frame of the bike so that I wouldn't even need a heat shield. You can see here how close the exhaust is to the side covers. And the exhaust was looking incredible and it was sounding even better. But it would turn out to be quite an expensive trial and error because after all the faffing around, it actually didn't work. But I'll cover this later in another video of why the exhaust didn't work out for me. After almost 2 years, the serious relationship that I was in actually also didn't work out. So I was back to where I started at the start of COVID. You can see the pattern here. I was again at a crossroads because I was living with my girlfriend at the time. I also had to move out and find my own space, which is not easy in London because space is so scarce, and I needed somewhere where I could work on the bike at the same time, which was proving to be really expensive. The reason why it was workshop number 5 is because I started working on the bike on the street, which was my first attempt. Then eventually I got a garage, which was a safe place for the bike, but it didn't have electricity, so I could only do so much there. Then my third attempt was working outside of my house, until eventually I put it into a shed and turned that into more of a semi-permanent workshop. And this was my attempt number 5 at creating a workshop where I could really get a lot of work done properly. And I knew that it had to be in the same place that I was staying. So I found a guardianship. And for those that don't know, a guardianship is a commercial building that is going through planning permission. And as a guardian, you look after the property to make sure that homeless people don't break into it. And you still pay rent, but the rate of your rent is highly reduced. So I'm showing these pictures to give you some insight into the living conditions that I was in, which went perfect, but it solved my issue of finding a space where I could use power tools and I had enough space on the ground floor to do it. Sometimes there would be literal outside of our house, and this is human because we live next to a mental health institute. And sometimes even syringes on our driveway. So here's my space. This was my bedroom that I repainted, and this was the second room that I turned into a workshop. Here's a little video. This is where I sleep. The room is not painted by me. It was already like that, but that's where I keep my clothes. This is where I keep my bike. This room is also the workshop area. I have some parts, and then I've got this wall with a shelf that has all my tools and stuff on there. And yeah, this is my current project. And by this point, I was single, didn't know what I was doing, had again no motivation, and a job that I wasn't particularly satisfied with, living in the city that I've gotten bored with. And I had this inherent need to go traveling. So I put one and the other together, and I realized that I would build my bike up so that I could go traveling with it. I went from quite a low place to an excited state of having a goal that in 6 months' time, from this point, I would venture into the unknown and go traveling on a bike. So I had a big project ahead, And in the next video, I'll go into way more detail and show you exactly how those 6 months transformed this bike into something that I still use today.